Hello and welcome back to this course of videos on MongoDB. Now if you recall in the last video we are creating an AJAX request and we're filling in the registration form and hitting the submit button to create an AJAX request, which is what this block of code is here. And we got up to the point where we communicated our payload, as we said. The payload here, which is the text from these input boxes, to our PHP server, and then when it returns it will run this success event handler. So let's take a look at register.php. So look at the backend code that receives our post request from AJAX, from our front-end JavaScript static file. So looking at register.php, let's walk through things one at a time. So first of all, I start my session, and now we'll come back to this later. This is about setting the session cookie, but we'll address that later on. We'll see how we use the session variable later. So my first statement here is a require statement, and I'm requiring dbconnect.php. Now what that does, let's take a look at dbconnect.php. This connects first to MySQL and then to my Mongo database. So they're both doing similar things. Here for MySQL I'm passing a user of root and an empty password. Here is when I'm using PDO and I am connecting to my local host using this code, and then I'm identifying my database using this statement here, and then passing in my username and password. So that creates my connection object here and connects to my database. These I'm just setting attributes for the server, and I have some just in case of error I echo back that there was an error. On the Mongo side, so we're actually requiring again on the Mongo side, and we're requiring, if you can see from this vendor folder. Now this vendor folder is the one that we actually created. If you remember when we installed Composer, if I just go to my CWAMP and shoestore, when we installed Composer, if you remember, it installed these three objects, and this folder was one of the things it installed. And this folder includes our PHP library, the API we can use to interface from PHP to MongoDB. So this require statement is pulling in that data so we can use that PHP library. What we are then doing then, similar to on the MySQL side, but we're doing it using Mongo this time. So here we are actually leveraging our PHP driver to connect to our local host. Here we actually are naming the port, which is 27017, which is the port that Mongo operates on. Again, local host. So this is making our connection to the MongoDB. Here's our connection object. And again, we're echoing back if there was any issues. One last thing we're doing on the Mongo side, if you look on the MySQL side, we passed in the database name as part of the connection string. However, here we're doing it separately. So we're creating a DB object. We're using our client object, which is like the connection object. And then we're using, this is the PHP version of dot notation, really. And we're saying we're allocating our shoestore database as the database that we want to work with. So we now have, through these two pieces of code, we now have connections to our MySQL database, shoe store, and we have connection to our Mongo database, shoe store. So that's what this require does here. I don't want to keep repeating that code, so I put it in a require statement. Here I'm using the PHP server global variable request method global variable to get the request type. So in this, I have post, put, and delete in here. In this video, we'll only be looking at the post request method, because when we click this submit button, if you look back at, I've actually got an if statement here, but we're sending a post request when that button, the value of that button is submit. So we're running post request. That's why we're only looking at this. So we're saying if the request type here is post, then we're looking at, we want to populate this payload variable on the server side. If you remember, we had a payload variable on the client side, but we're on the server side now. And the way we're going to get this payload is using the global post variable, and we are the actual variable name is data key. If you look on this side, when we submitted our data here in our Ajax, it was key value pair. The key was data key, and the value was our stringified payload. So we need to reference the key of this key value pair, which is data key. And this is exactly what we're doing here. We're pulling it from this very handy post global that PHP makes available to us. So we're pulling our payload from here. But then what we need to do, again, going back to main.js, you can see we stringified our JavaScript object to send across the wire on our post request. So on the back end, on the PHP side, we've received this JSON object through our post global variable. We need to convert it back to a PHP object. So it's actually transferred from a JavaScript object to a JSON object to go across the wire. Now on the back end, we're using this JSON decode method that the PHP library has made available to us, and we're converting our payload back into a PHP object so we can actually work with it. So that's that line of code here. Like I said, put and delete we'll discuss for later actions. Next thing we want to do, now we have our PHP object that contains all of the variables that were passed here. We want to actually extract them out. So you can see if request type is post, again, we're just going through and we're taking our PHP object, which is payload parsed, and putting them into their separate variables for the different values that were passed in on the input fields of this form. Now, this is an interesting line of code here, which really illustrates the difference between MySQL and Mongo. So as we mentioned previously, Mongo can store arrays within a Mongo document. One of the data types you can use is an array data type. In a MySQL database, you can't. So we have to, for MySQL, we actually have to split out this email array. If you remember, we want the JSON object that we passed through the actual email array. We concatenated it in this line of code here. So for Mongo, that's fine. We can submit to Mongo as an array, but for MySQL, we need to parse out the email array into two separate variables that will be put into the MySQL database as a string. And you'll see that later on. My next line of code here, again, if request type equals post, we now need to actually submit the data to our MySQL and Mongo database. However, before we proceed to that, I think I'll probably end the video because we're hitting the 10-minute mark. So In the next video, we'll look at actually inserting this data into our MySQL and Mongo databases, and I look forward to seeing you then.